The top story on ABC News Breakfast, it's passed one hurdle but looks set to fall at the next. The Prime Minister has made a plea to the Senate to pass a bill that would break the asylum seeker deadlock. It took 6 hours of emotional debate for the legislation to pass the House of Representatives last night.
The bill by independent MP Rob Oakeshott would restore offshore processing and allow asylum seekers to be sent to both Malaysia and Nauru. But it's unlikely to pass the Senate because the opposition and the Greens are refusing to support it.
We are on the verge of ending the impasse which has prevented our country processing asylum seekers offshore. We are just one day away from having a solution which would enable us to better deal with asylum seekers and to send a clear message of deterrence to people smugglers. I am calling on each and every senator to accept that this is now the only bill that can pass the Parliament before the Parliament goes into the winter recess.
The opposition leader Tony Abbott says the legislation compromises Australia's standards and will not stop the boats.
The House of Representatives voted not for a solution but for a stalemate, and I deeply regret the fact that the legislation that passed through the House of Representatives earlier this evening is doomed to fail in the Senate. And it should fail in the Senate because it is not good legislation. It compromises our standards and it will not stop the boats. What in fact it will mean is that the people smugglers will load up the boats with women and children, because the government has already indicated that women and children are most unlikely to be sent back to Malaysia.
Well, for more, our political editor Lyndall Curtis joins us now from Canberra. Good morning, Lyndall. They really were extraordinary scenes in Parliament yesterday.
Yes, it was another remarkable day in a Parliament that has actually produced many remarkable days. We had a cross-party meeting of MPs who wanted to find some sort of compromise while that was happening. The news came through of another asylum seeker boat that was in distress north of Christmas Island. Tony Abbott held a press conference to announce that he was going to put his own private member's bill into Parliament, which effectively covered the ground that the coalition sought to cover in amendments to government legislation to allow offshore processing, that is, to allow offshore processing in only those countries that are signatories to the UN Refugee Convention. Almost at the same time, the Prime Minister was in Parliament saying that instead of question time, she would move that debate be brought on Rob Oakeshott's compromise migration bill, which would allow offshore processing in those countries signatories to the Bali process, allow offshore processing in Malaysia and Nauru. So when the time for question time came, what became a 6-hour debate started. I think I counted around 62 speakers in that debate, some very passionate speeches, some very emotional speeches, particularly from people like Liberal Michael Keenan and Labor's Ed Husick, who'd both served on the committee inquiring into the Christmas Island tragedy last December. Very emotional speeches where people had acknowledged that their position had changed, other speeches imploring the House to find a compromise. At the end of that, the Prime Minister got what she wanted, which was passage narrowly of Rob Oakeshott's bill. It was not without many talks behind the scenes, some quite open on the floor of Parliament, talking to independents, talking to some Liberal MPs, including Mal Washer, that eventually that legislation was passed.
You talk about the conversations that were happening on the floor while those speeches were going on, and what came out of that for the coalition was Tony Abbott putting up a new proposal.
Yes, Tony Abbott put up a last-minute compromise deal where he sought to secure passage of what then became a coalition amendment to Rob Oakeshott's bill to allow effectively what the coalition wanted, which is processing in UN Refugee Convention signatories. He offered to increase the immigration intake if he came into power to 20,000 over 3 years. He offered a sunset clause for the legislation, and he offered a multi-party committee to look at a regional framework, a more regional cooperation, a regional approach to solving this problem. Now, there have been compromises on this issue on both sides and changes of position on both sides on this issue over many years. It has become a heated political debate over many years. At the end of last year at the ALP conference, the Immigration Minister offered the ALP, although with no specific time frame, an aspirational target of 20,000, an increase to 20,000 for the refugee and humanitarian migration intake. That was criticised by the coalition at the time, but both parties have made compromises. Before the last election, Julia Gillard didn't want to process in countries where that weren't signatories to the Refugee Convention. Tony Abbott thought it was all right. Their positions have now changed. Labor went to the 2007 election not wanting offshore processing. That position has now firmly changed, and there were some Labor MPs in the Parliament last night acknowledging that they had changed their minds on this, that there was a need for offshore processing, and in the words of one Labor MP, there were pull factors. There were factors that made Australia more attractive because of the Australian policies. So there have been compromises and changes in position in this debate for quite some time.
And Lyndall, the question is whether this has any chance of passing the Senate.
I think, Karina, the short answer is no. It is highly unlikely unless there was another extraordinary development. The Greens have held for a long time a position of being opposed to any offshore processing. The Greens leader, Christine Milne, welcomed Mr Abbott's compromise, welcomed the commitment to an increased refugee intake, but that was not enough to switch the Greens' position. Julia Gillard, as we heard earlier, was imploring senators to pass the bill because, as she said, it's the only bill before the Parliament, the only bill that would allow offshore processing that could get passage before Parliament gets up for its winter break. Tony Abbott was saying it is a Pyrrhic victory for the Prime Minister because the legislation that was passed in the House of Representatives last night will not pass the Senate.
Lyndall Curtis, we know you had a very long and big day in Canberra yesterday and a long night as well, so we thank you very much for waking up so early for us this morning. We'll talk to you soon.